For my next 1950s project, I chose this dress pattern from 1959. I've had this pattern for a little while now and have been waiting to find the perfect vintage fabric for it. I came across this vintage polka dot cotton in a fabric shop in Brighton. I knew it was vintage as it still had a label on that said "Made in Czechoslovakia." It's most probably from the 80s, but blue and white polka dots are a pretty classic 50s motif, so I went with it. I almost always trace my patterns, as I normally make several fit adjustments at this stage, but as this was a Mrs. pattern, my 163cm self matched the size guide almost exactly, so I skipped that step and just cut the pattern as is. I am making view 2 with the short sleeves, but I'm leaving off the skirt bands and detachable collar, as this dress already has one hell of a statement collar. The skirt is made of 3 of these rectangular panels and has a placket opening at the centre front that matches to the button front on the bodice. The skirt has a deep self-faced hem, but the pattern instructions also called for some bias strips to hem the sleeves and neck edge, so I used my pattern master to help cut those. There was a lot of markings to transfer on this pattern, but as with my slip, I didn't want to use coloured chalk if I could help it, so I mostly used tailor's tacks to mark all the pleats and darts. The previous owner of this pattern had obviously done the same thing, as there were little perforations at the small circles. This meant that I could sew through these little gaps to make sure my markings were as accurate as possible without causing the pattern further damage. I could then carefully peel off the pattern paper before pulling apart the 2 layers of fabric and snipping the threads in between. I used these little clips to hold the pattern in place instead of pins, which also prevented more holes in the pattern paper. I carried on transferring all the markings for the pleats, dart and balance marks, as well as tacking in the centre front of the bodice. This is really important for garments where the closure has an overlap, as these need to match up exactly for a good fit. I then started work on the back pattern piece by stay stitching the neckline, following the directions indicated in the instructions. I stitched in the small neck darts, remembering not to reverse at the point, but instead to leave long threads. These are then tied off and trimmed down. Next, I moved on to the pleats at the waist. I matched the balance marks using a pin and then pinched the layers tight before putting in a second cross pin and removing the first holding pin. I then machined these pleats in place. I had a bit of a delay before I could start on the front, as I was waiting for my interfacing to arrive in the post, so I took my government-sanctioned daily exercise to visit the ducklings.
Oh, hi cutie pies. Look at you little things.
Several days and many distractions later, my interfacing arrived. I had chosen woven non-fusible interfacing for historical accuracy. I cut all the pieces that needed interfacing before returning to the front pieces. I started by turning the front-facing edge under by 1/4 inch or 6mm and pinning in place. I then pinned in place the strip of interfacing that reinforces the centre front and the buttonholes. I took the fronts to the machine and stitched the facing edge under, pivoting at the corner. I then turned up the stitch length and machine basted the interfacing in place, firstly at the hem and then along the centre front, which I had tacked in place by hand earlier. I then trimmed the interfacing down to the shape of the neck. Then I pinned in the side bust darts, matching the balance marks with holding pins and then cross-pinning the dart in place. I also pinned in the pleats at the waist in the same way, matching the balance marks before cross-pinning in place. To mark the sewing line for the darts, I used a tracing wheel and a piece of cardboard to protect my table. This leaves a little pattern of indentations that will disappear when ironed. This is a great way to mark in a sewing line when you can't use chalk. I stitched the darts along my traced line, leaving the long tail threads at the point. I then stitch in the pleats at the waist, pivoting at the top of the pleat to create a little right angle. I tie off the threads of my darts and trim them down before removing as many of the tailor's tacks as I can from the darts and the pleats. I then take the fronts to the ironing board and give everything a thorough press. The hemmed facing edges, the waist pleats, and the darts. I press the darts over a tailor's ham to make sure I get a neat point. Then I move on to the collar. I pin the interfacing to the wrong side of one layer of the collar and then machine tack it in place around all 3 edges. I then trim down the interfacing close to the stitching to reduce bulk. Then with the right sides together, I pin the 2 layers of the collar around the outside edges, that is the edges without balance marks. I then machine them in place, pivoting at the corner for a sharp point. I then trim the seam allowances of the main fabric down and notch the curved edge so that the collar will lay flat once turned inside out. I also trim the corners to reduce bulk and help with that essential sharp point. Then back to the ironing board for a good press. I turn the collar right side out and use my fingernails to crease the seam open before using the steam of the iron to help roll the edge into shape. I then give it a firm press. It was at this moment I realised that I'd forgotten to stay stitch the neck edges on the front, so I quickly did that before proceeding with the collar. I joined the shoulder and side seams, making sure to match the balance marks, and then press them open. I then overlapped the 2 halves of the collar at the centre back, matching the circles, and then machine tacked them in place, sewing all the way along the open edge of the collar. I then pinned the collar to the neckline, matching the markings, and tacked that in place, making sure to keep adjusting the angle of the bodice to prevent puckers. It's been a while since I've made anything with a collar like this, and I'm not gonna lie, it felt really weird. I don't know if this is just me or if this is a bit of a funky vintage pattern moment. Let me know what you think. Once the collar was tacked on, I then folded back the front facings with right sides together and tacked those in place. Next, it was time for that bias strip that I had cut earlier. I pressed a fold into one side and matched the fold to the tacked sewing line, overlapping the edges of the facing slightly. I now think that I should have pinned the bias on the other way around because trying to press the other edge under once it was already on was really tricky. But hey, that's a lesson for next time. I then tacked the bias strip in place by hand. This was definitely needed as there were some points in this collar with 9 layers of fabric and it was becoming distorted with the pins. I then finally stitched the whole thing together in one go. This had to be done very slowly with lots of smoothing and adjusting on the way. To neaten the short edge of the bias strip, I simply folded them under as I got to them. I can't decide whether this was a really efficient way to sew the collar or unnecessarily long-winded. It did work for me on the first go though, so maybe all that tacking was necessary. With the collar on, it was time to set in the sleeves. I make up the sleeves by running gathering threads around the top of the sleeve head and then joining the sleeve seam, making sure to match the balance marks. I then pin the sleeve in place in 2 halves, easing in the excess as I go. Now I've actually made an entirely separate video dedicated to sleeves where I go into much greater detail, so to avoid repeating myself, I'll give you a quick overview here and leave a link to that video for you to watch in your own time. I evenly distribute the ease around the top of the sleeve head while keeping the underarm flat. I work in sections, smoothing the excess into the middle before halving it evenly with a pin. I repeat this process with as many pins as necessary before tacking the sleeve in place by hand. I then machine the sleeve in 2 halves, starting with the underarm and then returning to my starting point and working from the inside of the sleeve. This way I can smooth the excess as I go with my fingers, preventing tucks and puckers. I then hem my sleeve. This probably would have been easier to do before I set it in, but oh well. I pin the bias tape in place, matching the raw edges. Again, I should have pinned the tape on the other way around with the folded edge at the top, but I only realized this would be easier as I was editing this video, so next time. I leave a little excess to neaten the raw edges. And then machine the tape in place. Then, using my sleeve board, I press the bias tape around to the inside of the sleeve. And folded the remaining raw edge under for an even hem. I then pinned the hem in place. To neaten the join, I rolled the raw edges under so that they just met at the sleeve seam before I pressed the top edge in place. I also folded under the edge on the bias neck facing, which I ended up having to do around a tailor's ham to get it to lie correctly. I pinned it in place before steaming and pressing it over the ham to retain the curved shape. Then I hand stitched the bias facings in place. For the sleeve hems, I used a slip stitch, but for the curved neck facing, I decided to use a herringbone stitch, as I still wasn't sure it would lie completely flat, and that extra bit of movement from a herringbone stitch might cover a few sins. And with that, the bodice part of the dress was ready for a skirt. But this seems like a natural place to take a break, so I'm going to leave that until next time and part 2. If you'd like to see pockets, pleats, plackets, and of course the finished dress, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on that video. Thanks for watching part 1, and I'll see you next time.